You're not under attack because you're weak. You're under attack because you matter. Let that settle. Because somewhere along the way, you started believing the pressure meant you were failing. The chaos meant you were off track. The resistance meant you weren't called. But what if the exact opposite is true? What if the resistance is confirmation? What if the pressure is proof? Think about the last few months. The sudden exhaustion that doesn't make sense. The overthinking that hits hardest at night. The distraction right when you're trying to focus. The opportunities that almost happen, then collapse. The relationships that shift out of nowhere. The doubt that whispers, maybe you're not who you thought you were. And the most confusing part? It all intensifies when you start getting serious about growth. When you decide to pray more. When you start healing. When you commit to discipline. When you finally say, I'm done living small. That's when it gets loud. That's when the weight increases. That's when something pushes back. And you thought that meant you were doing something wrong. But no one wastes ammunition on something that isn't a threat. No one breaks into an abandoned house. No one fights for territory that has no value. The devil does not fight what belongs to him. He fights what threatens him. And lately, you've been threatening something. That's why the distraction is strategic. That's why the delay feels targeted. That's why the doubt sounds personal. Because it is. You see, attacks are rarely random. They are responses. A response to potential. A response to movement. A response to alignment. And the moment you started stepping into who you were supposed to become, something noticed. Not because you're perfect, but because you're becoming dangerous. Dangerous to stagnation. Dangerous to cycles. Dangerous to generational patterns. Dangerous to fear. And fear does not surrender territory quietly. It resists. It whispers. It manipulates. It isolates. And if it can't stop you with sin, it'll try to stop you with exhaustion. If it can't trap you with temptation, it'll distract you with overthinking. If it can't destroy you outright, it'll try to convince you to shrink yourself voluntarily. That's the strategy, not destruction, disruption. If you doubt your identity long enough, you'll never step into it. If you question your calling long enough, you'll never pursue it. If you believe the delay means denial, you'll stop expecting anything at all. And that's the real win. Not your downfall, your withdrawal. Because the most dangerous version of you isn't the one who fights loudly. It's the one who persists quietly. The one who stays consistent. The one who refuses to give up when it doesn't make sense. That version terrifies the enemy. So instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Ask, what is this trying to stop? Because attacks reveal value. Pressure reveals weight. Resistance reveals direction. And the intensity of the fight often reveals the size of the calling. You don't get attacked at random. You get attacked at transition. Right before growth. Right before breakthrough. Right before clarity. The pattern is ancient. Breakthrough is usually preceded by chaos. Elevation is often preceded by isolation. Purpose is usually revealed after pressure. So if things feel heavy right now, if your mind feels like a battlefield, if doubt keeps circling back even when you try to push forward, maybe it's not proof that you're failing. Maybe it's proof that you're advancing. And advancement triggers resistance. But here's what you need to understand before we go any further. The enemy only fights what threatens him. And the fact that there is a fight at all means you are not small. Stay with me. Because once you understand how this war actually works, you will never interpret your struggle the same way again. Most people misunderstand spiritual warfare. They imagine something dramatic, something cinematic, something visible. But the most dangerous battles are rarely loud. They are subtle, psychological, strategic. Spiritual warfare does not begin around you. It begins within you. It begins in your thoughts. Because if the enemy can control your thinking, he never has to control your circumstances. And that is the part most people miss. The battlefield is the mind. Not your house. Not your job. Not your bank account. Your mind. That's why the attacks often feel internal. You wake up anxious for no clear reason. You replay conversations that already ended. You imagine failure before you even begin. You question decisions you already made. Nothing exploded around you. but something shifted inside you. That's not random. It's strategic. Because thoughts shape identity, and identity shapes behavior. If you can be convinced that you are not enough, you will hesitate. If you hesitate, you will delay. If you delay long enough, you will miss opportunities. And if you miss enough opportunities, you'll start believing the lie was true. That's how the war is won. Not with destruction, with distortion. Distortion of identity. Distortion of purpose. Distortion of perception. Spiritual warfare is rarely about forcing you into evil. It's about nudging you into confusion. Confusion about who you are. Confusion about where you're going. Confusion about whether any of it even matters. Because clarity is power, and confusion is paralysis. Look at the pattern. The attack usually doesn't start with a major sin. It starts with a whisper. Are you sure? Are you sure you're called? Are you sure you're forgiven? Are you sure you're capable? Are you sure you're hearing God correctly? Doubt is the first weapon. Not because doubt is loud, but because doubt spreads quietly. And once doubt enters, insecurity follows. Then comparison. Then overthinking. Then exhaustion. And suddenly, you're fighting something you can't even name. You just feel off. That's how subtle this war is. The enemy understands something most people don't. You don't have to destroy someone to neutralize them. You just have to distract them. If you can't stop their destiny, delay it. If you can't silence their voice, exhaust it. If you can't break their faith, overwhelm their focus. That's why distraction is one of the strongest weapons in spiritual warfare. You don't fall into chaos overnight. You drift. One compromise. One missed discipline. One postponed prayer. One day of, I'll get back to it tomorrow. And tomorrow becomes a pattern. This isn't about guilt. It's about awareness. Because awareness breaks strategy. The enemy works in cycles. Observe your own life. When do the attacks increase? Right before a breakthrough. Right before a decision. Right before growth. Right before exposure. Because transition threatens territory. Whenever you shift into a new level of responsibility, influence, or maturity, resistance increases. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something significant. Spiritual warfare intensifies around transition. Think about it. When you start healing from trauma, old memories resurface. When you start pursuing discipline, temptation increases. When you begin stepping into leadership, insecurity attacks. Why? Because growth destabilizes what used to control you. And control doesn't surrender quietly. Here's another truth most people overlook. The enemy studies patterns. He doesn't need to know your future. He just needs to observe your habits, your triggers, your emotional weak points, the times you're most vulnerable. And he attacks there. Late at night, when you're tired, when you're alone, when you feel unseen, when you've just failed. The strategy isn't random chaos. It's targeted timing. That's why sometimes the attack feels personal. Because it is tailored, not in a mystical horror movie way, but in a psychological way. If rejection hurts you deeply, he'll use rejection. If comparison weakens you, he'll use comparison. If isolation destabilizes you, he'll push isolation. The goal is not possession. It's pressure. Pressure until you abandon pursuit. Pressure until you shrink your vision. Pressure until you settle. Because a settled calling is less threatening than a fulfilled one. And here's the part that changes everything. Spiritual warfare escalates in proportion to potential. The greater the impact you're capable of, the greater the resistance you will experience. Not because you're cursed, but because you're consequential. The enemy doesn't panic over spectators. He panics over participants. He doesn't attack those who are asleep. He attacks those who are waking up. Have you noticed that when you were spiritually numb, things felt easier? Not better, just easier. Less resistance, less inner tension, less urgency. But the moment you started seeking clarity, purpose, alignment, the battle intensified. That's not coincidence. That's confirmation. Because once you become aware of your calling, you become a threat. And threats are monitored. Spiritual warfare also works through narrative. The stories you tell yourself. I always mess things up. I'm not as strong as other people. This is just how my life is. Those narratives are seeds. Water them long enough, and they become identity. And once identity shifts, behavior follows automatically. That's why renewing your mind is warfare. Guarding your thoughts is warfare. Consistency is warfare. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's disruptive to the enemy's plan. Let me make this clear. Not every hardship is an attack. Let's address the question that's been sitting quietly in your mind. Why does it feel like the pressure around me is different? Why does it seem like every time I move forward, something pushes back? Why does growth feel like resistance instead of ease? Why me? And here's the uncomfortable but powerful truth. Because you are not average. You were never designed to be. But average lives don't experience uncommon resistance. You don't deploy strategy against something that isn't a threat. You don't guard territory against someone who has no intention of taking it. You don't fight what poses no future problem. And the resistance around your life isn't random chaos. It's reaction. Reaction to potential. Reaction to capacity. Reaction to calling. The enemy does not attack your present. He attacks your trajectory. And your trajectory is dangerous. Let's break something down clearly. There are people who drift through life. They don't question cycles. They don't confront generational dysfunction. They don't pursue discipline. They don't challenge comfort. And they don't experience unusual spiritual resistance. Why? Because they're predictable. Predictability is not threatening. But you started asking questions. You started breaking patterns. You started healing what your family ignored. You started seeking depth. You started refusing mediocrity. And that shift changed the atmosphere around you. Because growth destabilizes systems that relied on your stagnation. There are generational patterns that expected you to repeat them. Addiction, toxic relationships, financial mismanagement, emotional immaturity, low self-worth. And when you decided to break the cycle, something resisted. Because breaking cycles creates ripple effects. And ripple effects threaten territory. You are not just fighting for yourself. You are fighting for what comes after you. And that is what makes you dangerous. You have to understand this. The weight on your life is proportionate to the impact of your obedience. If you carried nothing significant, you would not feel significant resistance. But the pressure is heavy because the assignment is heavy. That doesn't mean you're flawless. It means you're influential. Influence doesn't start when you get a platform. It starts when you shift internally. When your mindset changes, your decisions change. When your decisions change, your outcomes change. And when your outcomes change, the people around you change. That's threat. The enemy does not fear your talent. He fears your transformation. Talent can be wasted. Transformation spreads. When you heal, others get permission to heal. When you lead, others rise. When you overcome, others believe it's possible. And that chain reaction destabilizes darkness. So the pressure increases. But let's go deeper. Some of you have experienced resistance since childhood. Unusual challenges. Heavy responsibility too early. Isolation. Misunderstanding. Feeling different. Feeling like you saw things others didn't. That wasn't accidental. Sensitivity often accompanies calling. Awareness often accompanies assignment. You were never wired for shallow living. You were wired for depth. And depth attracts resistance. Because depth produces impact. There's also another layer. You have influence you haven't even stepped into yet. You think the attack is about who you are now. It's not. It's about who you are becoming. The enemy sees patterns too. He sees your resilience. He sees how you survive what should have crushed you. He sees how you keep getting back up. He sees how failure doesn't finish you. And that persistence signals future authority. Authority over fear. Authority over insecurity. Authority over cycles. Authority over doubt. That authority threatens systems that thrive on your smallness. Have you noticed something? The closer you get to clarity, the louder the confusion becomes. The closer you get to discipline, the stronger the distraction becomes. The closer you get to commitment, the stronger the temptation becomes. That's not coincidence. That's timing. Timing reveals value. You don't guard a door that leads nowhere. You guard access to something valuable. And access to your future is heavily guarded. not by coincidence, by design. Because if you fully step into your potential, you will disrupt more than your own life. Let's talk about calling. Calling is not just ministry. Calling is responsibility. Calling is influence. Calling is impact in your sphere. Some of you are called to lead. Some are called to build. Some are called to create. Some are called to restore. Some are called to speak. Some are called to mentor. Some are called to carry wisdom into places that lack it. And every calling disrupts darkness in a different way. But disruption invites resistance. If you never intended to grow, you wouldn't feel so much pushback when you try. If you never intended to change, the cycle wouldn't fight so hard to keep you. If you never intended to rise, insecurity wouldn't scream so loudly. The resistance reveals the value of what you carry. Let me say something that might stretch you. The enemy studies leaders early, before they know they're leaders, before they accept it, before they feel ready. Because insecurity in a future leader is easier to plant than remove. So he plants doubt early. He plants fear early. He plants comparison early. He plants wounds that distort identity. Because if identity stays fractured long enough, leadership stays dormant. And dormant leaders don't threaten anything. But awakened ones do. Why you? Because you don't quit easily. You bend, but you don't break. You question, but you don't abandon. You feel fear, but you move anyway. That combination is dangerous. Most people stop at discomfort. You endure it. Most people shrink when misunderstood. You internalize it, process it, and grow. Most people collapse under pressure. You adapt. That adaptability is threat. And here's another truth. You've survived things you never should have survived. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And survival builds authority. Authority builds confidence. Confidence builds influence. Influence builds impact. And impact threatens darkness. So the resistance isn't punishment. It's recognition. Recognition of what you carry. Recognition of your ceiling. Recognition of your trajectory. The enemy doesn't fear who you are today. He fears who you'll be if you don't quit. That's why exhaustion hits hard. Because exhaustion slows destiny. If he can't stop you, he'll try to tire you. If he can't deceive you, he'll try to drain you. If he can't break your faith, he'll try to make you emotionally numb. Because numb people don't pursue purpose aggressively. But here's the part you need to hear. The fact that you're still here, still seeking, still listening, still wanting growth, means the strategy hasn't worked. You're still moving, even if slowly. You're still believing, even if quietly. You're still fighting, even if tired. And tired warriors are still warriors. Why you? Because you're not passive. You wrestle with truth. You confront yourself. You reflect. You adjust. You evolve. And evolution is threatening. The enemy doesn't panic over potential alone. He panics over potential combined with persistence. You are not attacked because you're weak. You are attacked because you're advancing. You are attacked because you're awakening. You are attacked because you're aligning. And alignment produces acceleration. But here's the shift. Once you understand why you stop asking, why is this happening to me? And you start asking, what is this preparing me for? Because preparation often feels like pressure. And pressure often precedes promotion. The resistance around your life is not random chaos. It's strategic opposition to strategic destiny. And if the fight is this intense, then your future must be that significant. Now let's identify it clearly. Because once you can recognize the signs of being targeted, you stop being confused by the pressure and start navigating it with authority. Not every hard season is spiritual warfare, but when resistance clusters around growth, clarity, and obedience, that's not random. There are patterns. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Here are the signs. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but strategic. Key cap: 1. Distraction increases right before breakthrough. Have you noticed this? You'll be focused for weeks. Disciplined, consistent, clear. Then suddenly, distraction floods in. Random urges to scroll endlessly. Old habits resurfacing. Tiny emergencies that feel urgent but aren't important. Conversations that drain your mental space. And it always happens right when you're about to step into something new. Right before launching something. Right before committing fully. Right before making a decision that elevates you. That's not coincidence. Breakthrough threatens stagnation. And distraction is cheaper than destruction. The enemy doesn't need to ruin your life. He just needs to dilute your focus. Because diluted focus weakens momentum. Momentum is powerful. Once you're moving consistently, change accelerates. So the strategy is simple. Interrupt momentum. Make you busy instead of effective. Make you entertained instead of disciplined. Make you reactive instead of intentional. And the tragedy? Distraction rarely feels dangerous. It feels harmless. That's why it works. If your focus has been unusually attacked lately, ask yourself, what was I about to step into? Keycap 2. Sudden division in relationships. Another sign. When you begin to elevate, not everyone can go with you. And sometimes division feels spiritual before it feels logical. Misunderstandings increase. Conversations become tense. Support feels distant. People who once celebrated you start questioning you. It hurts. Because isolation is one of the strongest psychological pressures. But understand this. Growth shifts dynamics. When you change internally, the roles around you shift. If someone benefited from your insecurity, your confidence threatens them. If someone was comfortable with your smallness, your expansion unsettles them. And sometimes the enemy amplifies that tension, not to destroy you, but to isolate you. Because isolated people are easier to discourage. But here's the twist. Sometimes separation is protection, not punishment. If certain voices stayed in your ear while you were rising, they would dilute your clarity. So division isn't always attack. Sometimes it's alignment. The question is not, why are they acting different? The question is, what level am I stepping into that requires different alignment? Keycap 3. Overthinking intensifies at night. The day might feel manageable, but the night? That's when the war gets loud. You replay conversations. You imagine worst-case scenarios. You question your worth. You feel behind. You feel inadequate. And the thoughts feel heavier after midnight. Why? Because fatigue weakens resistance. When your body is tired, your mental guard lowers. And that's when doubt sneaks in. Overthinking is one of the most underestimated weapons in spiritual warfare. Because it feels self-generated. It feels like you. But many of those thoughts are exaggerations. Distortions. Amplifications. What if you fail? What if this doesn't work? What if you're embarrassing yourself? What if you're not called? Notice something. The thoughts are future-based fear, not present reality. That's strategic. Because fear of the future can paralyze action in the present. If your nights have been louder than usual, it's not weakness. It's warfare targeting your imagination. Because imagination fuels faith. And if imagination gets hijacked by fear, faith weakens. Guard your night. That's not dramatic advice. That's strategic advice. Keycap 4. Delay right when you're ready. This one frustrates people the most. You feel ready, prepared, aligned, then delay. Emails unanswered. Opportunities postponed. Doors that almost open, then close. And it feels personal, like you misread the timing. But here's something you need to consider. Delay doesn't mean denial. Sometimes delay builds capacity. Sometimes delay exposes motives. Sometimes delay strengthens endurance. But in spiritual warfare, delay also tests belief. Because if your faith collapses under waiting, the enemy wins without a fight. Waiting seasons are psychological pressure chambers. They expose impatience. Keycap 6. Old temptations resurface. You thought you healed that. You thought you moved past it. You thought you outgrew it. Then suddenly, the same temptation resurfaces. Old habits calling your name. Old coping mechanisms whispering comfort. And it shocks you. Why am I struggling with this again? Because growth triggers resistance from past versions of you. The enemy will always try to pull you backward when you step forward. Regression is safer than progression, from his perspective. If he can't stop your future, he'll try to reconnect you to your past. Not because you're weak, but because the past is familiar, and familiarity feels safe under pressure. But familiar doesn't mean aligned. The resurfacing of old temptation doesn't mean you failed. It means you're advancing into territory that requires higher discipline. And higher discipline always invites testing. Keycap 7. You feel unusually tired. Not physically, spiritually, mentally. Like everything requires more effort than usual. Like you're carrying invisible weight. That exhaustion isn't always lack of sleep. Sometimes it's decision fatigue. Sometimes it's emotional processing. Sometimes it's internal resistance. And sometimes it's warfare trying to wear you down. Because tired people compromise easier. Tired people lower standards. Tired people shrink goals. But here's the key. Fatigue doesn't mean stop. It means strengthen your source. The enemy wants you to interpret exhaustion as incapability. But exhaustion often follows growth. Growth consumes energy. And expansion requires recovery, not retreat. Here's what ties all these signs together. They intensify around movement, not stagnation. If you were drifting, you wouldn't feel targeted. If you were asleep spiritually, you wouldn't feel resistance. If you were small in your vision, you wouldn't feel pressure. The presence of resistance suggests the presence of significance. The fight suggests value. The tension suggests transition. And once you see the pattern, you stop personalizing the pressure and start recognizing the strategy. But there's one thing the enemy hopes you never realize. One truth that flips the entire narrative. Because the attack isn't just about stopping you. It's revealing something. And once you see that, the pressure loses its intimidation. The attack is not just opposition. It's information. Let that sink in. The resistance around your life is revealing something. And what it reveals is not weakness. It reveals weight. The enemy does not initiate war over something insignificant. He calculates. He observes. He responds. And the intensity of the response tells you something about the level of threat. So if the pressure has increased, if the doubt has escalated, if the resistance feels concentrated, it may not be proof that you are failing. It may be proof that you are close. Close to breakthrough. Close to clarity. Close to stepping into something irreversible. Because warfare escalates near transition. Think about it. Security increases around something valuable. Guards don't stand outside empty buildings. Protection surrounds importance. And the level of resistance around your future is a clue. Here's what they don't want you to realize. The attack is confirming your direction, not contradicting it. You assume that if God was leading you, it would feel smooth, effortless, peaceful without interruption. But alignment doesn't eliminate opposition. It exposes it. When you step into light, darkness reacts. Not because it can win, but because it feels threatened. And threatened systems always push back. Another truth. The attack reveals your growth. Have you noticed that what used to destroy you now only distracts you? What used to break you now only slows you. What used to define you now only tempts you. That shift matters. Because resistance evolves when you evolve. The enemy upgrades strategy when you upgrade discipline. He increases pressure when you increase clarity. That means you are not where you used to be. And growth that threatens darkness will always be contested. Here's something deeper. The attack exposes your future authority. Authority is born from overcoming. You don't gain authority over fear without confronting fear. You don't gain authority over doubt without wrestling doubt. You don't gain authority over insecurity without surviving insecurity. The very things attacking you are the areas you are being strengthened in. That's not poetic. It's structural. Pressure builds muscle. Resistance builds endurance. Opposition builds clarity. If you never faced confusion, you wouldn't learn discernment. If you never faced delay, you wouldn't learn patience. If you never faced doubt, you wouldn't develop conviction. The enemy doesn't just attack randomly. He attacks in areas connected to your future influence. If he attacks your confidence, you're likely called to lead. If he attacks your voice, you're likely called to speak. If he attacks your identity, you're likely called to impact others. If he attacks your discipline, you're likely called to build something lasting. The attack is predictive. It hints at your future. But here's the part they don't want you to see. You are stronger than the pressure suggests. You feel overwhelmed because you're growing. You feel stretched because your capacity is increasing. You feel tired because you're carrying more responsibility. But you are not collapsing. You're expanding. Expansion feels uncomfortable. It feels unstable. It feels uncertain. But it is not destruction. It is development. Another hidden truth. The enemy cannot create anything new in your life. He can only distort what already exists. He cannot invent purpose. He can only attempt to interrupt it. He cannot assign identity. He can only attempt to confuse it. That means everything he fights is something God placed in you first. The attack is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of presence. Presence of calling. Presence of potential. Presence of impact. You thought the resistance meant you were behind. But what if it means you are ahead of schedule? What if the reason it feels intense is because acceleration is near? The enemy fights because pressure rarely increases without purpose. And here's the final piece of this truth. The attack cannot cancel your calling. It can only test your agreement. Agreement with fear. Agreement with doubt. Agreement with limitation. The only way the enemy wins is if you adopt his narrative. If you start saying, maybe I'm not called. Maybe I'm not capable. Maybe this isn't for me. That internal agreement is the real battlefield. But once you refuse agreement, the power dynamic changes. The pressure may still exist, but intimidation disappears because you see it for what it is. Confirmation, not cancellation. And when you understand that, you stop fighting emotionally and you start fighting intelligently, which brings us to the next part. Because spiritual warfare is not one with drama, it's one with discipline. If the battlefield is the mind, then the weapon is discipline, not emotion, not intensity, not volume. Discipline. Most people try to fight spiritual warfare with feelings. They react. They panic. They spiral. But emotion is unstable. And unstable weapons don't win long wars. You don't win spiritual battles by feeling stronger. You win them by thinking clearer. So let's break this down strategically. Keycap 1. Guard your thoughts aggressively. You cannot control every thought that enters your mind, but you can control which ones stay. That distinction changes everything. A thought arriving is not failure. A thought settling is agreement. The enemy's strategy is repetition. If he repeats a lie long enough, it feels familiar. If it feels familiar, it feels true. So you have to interrupt repetition. When doubt says, "You're not ready," you counter with evidence. "I have prepared." When fear says, "You will fail," you counter with memory. "I have survived worse." When insecurity says, "You're not enough," you counter with identity. "I am growing." This is not motivational talk. This is mental discipline. You don't entertain every thought. You interrogate it. Ask, is this fact? Is this fear? Is this projection? Is this distortion? Most anxiety dissolves under examination. The enemy thrives on unchallenged narratives. Challenge them. Keycap 2. Starve what weakens you. Not everything that feels harmless is neutral. Some habits dilute strength. Endless scrolling. Constant comparison. Overconsumption of noise. If distraction is a weapon, then attention is power. Where your attention goes, your identity follows. If you feed comparison daily, insecurity grows. If you feed fear-based content daily, anxiety grows. If you feed discipline daily, strength grows. You are not powerless in this. You choose what shapes your mind. And starving what weakens you is not restriction. It's protection. You don't remove distractions because you're religious. You remove them because you're focused. Keycap 3. Protect your routine. Spiritual warfare often attacks consistency. Why? Because consistency builds momentum, and momentum builds transformation. So the enemy will try to disrupt routine. Sleep schedule thrown off. You are not under attack because you are weak. You are under attack because you are advancing. And there is a massive difference between those two interpretations. For too long, you interpreted pressure as punishment. You interpreted delay as disqualification. You interpreted doubt as deficiency. But now you see it differently. Now you recognize the pattern. The enemy only fights what threatens him. And the fact that there is a fight at all means you are not insignificant. You are not random. You are not drifting. You are moving. You are growing. You are disrupting something that was comfortable with your smallness. That's why it feels intense. But intensity is not defeat. Intensity is resistance to momentum. And momentum is on your side. Look at your life honestly. You have survived things that should have ended you. Moments that could have broken your faith. Seasons that could have convinced you to quit. Opportunities that collapsed. Relationships that shifted. Delays that frustrated you. Doubt that whispered loudly. And yet, you are still here. Still listening. Still seeking. Still fighting. That alone disproves the narrative that you are losing. Because losing people stop showing up. They stop trying. They stop believing. You didn't. You bent. You questioned. You got tired. But you did not withdraw. And that persistence reveals something powerful. You are not fragile. You are forged. Forged by pressure. Forged by disappointment. Forged by delay.